Hello, Divine Ones. Minister Ashley here, and this discussion is going to be about Delilah, the primary figure. However, I'm going to dive into some of the other elements and characters that are surrounding her story. All right, so this is actually part of like a little series in the Women and Goddesses of the Bible series. So it's the bad bitches of the Bible. Yes, the bad bitches, okay? So, Delilah. We have heard about Delilah. People that don't even, read the Bible have heard about Delilah. I know that in my church days that Delilah was one of those villainesses that you do not want to cross. If you were a man, she was used as a woman that you don't want to entertain. And if you were a woman and you were called a Delilah or even a Jezebel, you were known to be a fast woman, sexually promiscuous woman. But as I dive into this discussion, you will see that that's not the case at all. All right, let's get into it.
I am in my goddess era. I don't want to be a princess, a queen, a boss, a babe, or even a bad bitch. I want to be a celestial being with powers that aren't of this realm.
Topics that I'm going to cover in this discussion is the name and etymology, storyline, emotional trauma dumping, sex therapy and magic, the other woman, good girl versus the bad girl. And this is a topic that sort of kind of touched on in several other discussions, and it will continue to be the dichotomy of these two archetypes that I will bring up in future discussions. For those that don't know, that I have been working on a book about women and goddesses of the Bible entitled The Sacred Grail, Women and Goddesses of the Bible. So the pre-order link is listed either in the description box or either in the link in the bio. So go check that out. A little side note, the member section across the platforms. Every Thursday when I go live, I also have a PDF associated with these presentations. PDF, I have additional notes. At midnight on Thursday, I will post the PDFs, and that will be on the private members only Discord. You can join as little as $2.99 a month, and I post weekly. I post actually a couple times a week. So, okay, let's dive into it. Go over the names. First, we want to start with Samson. So Samson, the name derives from a Hebrew name, Shimshon, which itself comes from another Hebrew word, Shemish, meaning son. Samson is depicted wrestling a lion. The animal is related to the house of Leo in Judah. So both of these archetypes are governed by the sun. If you know anything about astrology and the symbology with Samson, the lion, Leo, and the sun. So this is important, so keep this in mind. The sun is edified in this house. I'm going to get to the other people in this story, but I want to first jump down to Delilah because she's one of the primary figures in this story. So Delilah, the name originating from Hebrew, primarily signifies delicate or she who weakened. It is also linked to the notions of languishing or being weakened, which means to hang down or to languish. Delilah embodies the theme of weakness associated with men, while in Western astrology, the seventh house represents the sphere of relationships. As a masculine figure linked to the sun, Samson's deep desire for an intimate connection becomes his greatest vulnerability. So here we have the sun, that is the mighty, powerful archetype in astrology and alchemy, all these different sacred sciences, but it is weakened by the desire for connectivity. Imagine if you're the most powerful, for example, in the solar system, the sun is considered to be the most powerful entity, light source, consciousness, if you will, depending on how you look at it. But it can be devoured by the need to be matched in energy. So this is something that happens in relationship dynamics. But how do you find one's equal? Like, that's what it boils down to when it comes to the art of relationships, relating, that can be our downfall. In Samson's case, that was. All right, now let's go to his first wife. And she's not really named, but here I have a name, which is the name of the city or the town that she lived in. It's Timnah. The unnamed woman from Timnah in Judges 14 is a Philistine woman whom Samson decides to marry despite his parents' disapproval and cultural rifts between their peoples. Her approval to Samson promotes him to pursue the union, setting the stage for a complex narrative filled with a riddle and betrayal. This marriage plays a pivotal role in Samson's tale. Unbeknownst to many people, Samson had a third wife and, well, a third relationship, if you will, because Delilah wasn't his wife that we know of. So the woman from Gaza, which whom he engaged in acts of fornication. The rabbis interpret this as an example of a Hebrew word. It represents measure for measure. Because this improper act occurred in Gaza, Judges 16:1, once Samson went to Gaza, the Philistines punished him by capturing him. It's stated in verse 21, brought him down to Gaza. So pretty much he was captured because of his indecent acts that he was performing with the women of Gaza. So it wasn't just this one woman of Gaza, but this was a pivotal relationship that sometimes is conflated with Delilah. So as we continue on, you will see that how it's conflated. So give me a second. Now let's walk through this sequence of events. So we know exactly who these characters are for the most part. Samson is a judge of Israel. So a judge is to the equivalent of a king, but probably more steeped in more responsibilities spiritually, because it's unto a deity. So a king can be a king without necessarily being attached to a religion. Okay, so he had a duty, a responsibility. So he's born as a Nazerite. That means that he wasn't supposed to partake in any alcohol, no wine, definitely no fornication. You know, he was to uphold all of the laws, and he wasn't supposed to cut his hair. And so that is where we're going to get to a little later when it comes to Delilah. Okay, so he had this covenant from birth. So he already knew this from the day that he was born. He knew what his duty was, and he was raised that way. So it is actually his responsibility to conduct himself a certain way. Okay, so keep that in mind. So it's not like he's just a regular man of Israel. He has a great responsibility, almost to the magnitude of a prophet, someone that is set aside, or a priest that is set aside for God's specific purpose. Continue on with the storyline. So he see this cute little Philistine honey. He's like, oh, okay, she cute. And so he wants to marry her. So he asked for her hand in marriage, and the father was like, okay. And then he went to his parents. He was like, you know what, parents, I found this beautiful girl. Yeah, she's a Philistine. Yeah, I want to marry her. And his parents was against it because the Philistines were the enemy of his people. Okay, you know about David and Goliath. You know about, the whole history with the Philistines and the Israelites. So he was pretty much wanting to entertain the company and marry and procreate, continue his lineage with his family and his people's enemy. So of course his parents were against it, but in the scriptures it says that unbeknownst to his family, his parents, that it was part of God's plan, and we're going to see how God's plan unfolds. So he sends his parents to set up the negotiations. So if you don't know, that in the culture, it was up to the parents, primarily the father, to set up the marital preparations. And typically the father of the groom would pay a purse for the bride. And so that whole negotiation went down, and so they were betrothed. And pretty much, from what I read, it technically was that they were married, or they weren't quite married, depending on which text you may read in the interpretation. So anyway, they had some type of a union, and from what we gather, they didn't consummate the union. He's at the wedding feast, and he's feeling himself a Leo, bragging, drinking. He decides to make a wager, like a bet. And earlier that day, on the way to go meet his bride, he wrestles a lion, and then in the carcass, when he came back, he sees honey inside of the carcass. So anyways, he wants to bet the Philistines for, I think it was like 30 robes and 30 shekels of silver. So he presents a riddle to them, and they can't guess it, but he says he'll give them 3 days, I believe. So it's a lot of numerology in here. So come 3 days, his wife, when he would go visit her, she cried to him, "Samson, tell me what the riddle is." Working on his emotions, he tells her, and she ends up telling the Philistines. And the last day, he had to pay up because they figured out the riddle. Her family were threatened to protect her family. She was burdened with the task of betraying her husband. He murdered 30 Philistines, innocent men. Yes, they may have been his enemy, but he's about to marry a Philistine woman and be a part of their people. So he kills 30 of innocent men and takes their silver and their clothes, and he pays up. He's upset. He decides to go back to his people just to cool off. And what happened is that the Philistines ended up setting the house on fire with them in there, and they end up passing on. He ends up finding out that what happened to her, and so in his rage, that's when he sets the crops on fire. So let's examine what happened to his father-in-law and his wife. So because he decides he wants to take a Philistine bride because of what we gather, her beauty, if we continue to see throughout his pattern, he's captivated by foreign women's beauty. And that's for a topic. Some people go into that topic of you like what you like, but we see towards the end the lust of his flesh through the eyes. I will bring that back up later. We also can see this with the company that he decides to keep later on, when we will go into that topic. But because of this, and her, not necessarily her, but her father and his father, with his father, he convinced his father to come together so that way they can make that decision on her behalf. In that culture and many other cultures, even still to this day, it's up to the men to, it's their decision if the girl can get married, woman or girl can be married. And usually it comes with a purse, like financial gain for the family. So having a woman, a girl, especially a beautiful girl, unblemished, is a benefit, a financial benefit. You can also see this sort of kind of echoed in our culture even to this day. Like about 70% of women that get married, they take on the last name of their husband. And it's very few the male takes on the female's last name, or she just keeps her same last name. Women that get married and their last name is changed, a lot of that history is lost, especially further back in the days, before internet and before keeping proper documentation of names and name changes, that a lot of that history was lost. So a woman had a more difficult time of tracking her family history back to a lot of the maternal leaders. The power in the name. I did a video on the members section like a couple years ago about the power of the name and how much power your name holds in vibration frequency, but also in the etymology, also in the history that is linked to the name, also in the symbology of the meaning of the name. And a lot of power and authority is lost for the woman when it comes to her name. As we can see, like in the very beginning with Samson's name, a very powerful name, and we can see with a lot of, especially cultures that their names are related to deities, you can see the connection and gain power in the name. What happened with his first wife was traumatic experience for the family. I'm pretty sure she probably had other siblings, possibly. Samson's next, not really wife, but woman, the woman from Gaza. So this is where we get the conflation between another woman that was actually a prostitute compared to Delilah in Gaza, with whom he engaged in the act of fornication, as I mentioned before. And that is mentioned in Judges 16:1. Once Samson went to Gaza, the Philistines punished him by capturing him, okay? And they stated in verse 21 that they brought him down to Gaza. And pretty much this is what happened. He became a sex slave. Because of his stature, so the son, all right, I'm about to get into some really esoteric stuff here. And I may just put this in the members. The son, the potency of the sun is represented in occult traditions as semen. That's why it's masculine. Because the moon would be the receiver. When the sun and the moon come in alignment with one another, it represents like a sexual union. So with the sun being known as related to the substance of semen, and the potency of the semen, like strong, all of these attributes that represent Samson, with Sam and Sun, both of these are two double potency, so could be double placement of really strong sun energy, really strong potent energy. So he had to be potent because they used him as a mating slave, pretty much. He wasn't even there to please the woman. He was there because of his strong stature, his status, his ability. He had supernatural strength. It says here, each Philistine would bring his wife. So I don't, with that word wife, I don't know if they mean like their actual wife or they mean like maybe their concubine, to Samson in prison, hoping he would father a child who would possess the same strength as him. In this context, the rabbis refer to the saying, before a wine drinker set wine, before a plowman set baskets of roots. Given Samson's notorious reputation with women, they brought women to him as a part of his punishment. And this is in the alternative text. Illustrate that Samson's actions in his earlier life shaped his eventual fate, and that his punishment was fitting for his crimes. So this is another thing about potency, semen in the sun. So when the sun hits the highest pinnacle in the sky, it's only going down, decreasing in its potency as time goes on. And this is astrologically, we can see this in our world. So if the sun is related to semen and man is continuously, that he loses his strength, and that's one way how they were able to contain him, is because he was losing his potency, he was losing his strength, he was losing his power. Another side note is about semen retention, and this was a practice that some people still use to this day, but it was an ancient practice, and some believe that Christ used this, and other strong magi's, strong religious figures, and people that had supernatural abilities and strength. John the Baptist, possibly. Male prostitution is a real thing. It was definitely prevalent then, and it still is now. Okay. Another note about what was happening to him, it was very traumatic. I mean, imagine just being used for, you think that would be a man's greatest desire, but you're being drained of your life force. He was being drained of his life force, not only in that manner, but also probably malnourished. And to create semen in the body. It is a high consistency of water and other nutrients, minerals, and all that stuff that comes from the body. So I'm pretty sure that that's one way how they kept him imprisoned. There also is a factor to this about sexual abuse. Who knows what torment he experienced there. But, okay, let's move on. Okay, so traumatic, drained of his life force. He meets Delilah. So Delilah, like I said, never was a prostitute. So I'm going to paint a different picture of these two here. Okay, so Delilah, she was never a Philistine either. The Bible, the text does not say that she was a Philistine. Pretty much she just worked alongside the Philistines, at least for this one project. So him being released, let's give it a modern day filter. Guy does something, gets incarcerated, experienced trauma while being incarcerated. It's a traumatic experience for anyone. He gets released. He doesn't have his family. He doesn't have any resources. With the trauma that he experienced, because yes, it was trauma. One thing about this is not only about male prostitution, but also abuse, sexual abuse, from a wide variety. So we do know that the high statistics of documented cases with women, but there are also documented cases and a lot of undocumented cases found in men. So I will go over more notes and stuff in the members only video. So one thing we have to address here is, where did Samson, where did he stay after he left? Because he was not in his homeland. He met Delilah. And so let's think about this in a modern concept. Someone is incarcerated, a male is incarcerated, a traumatic experience. And especially in his case, it was definitely a traumatic experience. So he's a broken man, okay? Very broken. He meets Delilah. So Delilah, once again, could have just been a regular woman. She could have seen him on the street, or who knows exactly how they met, but they met. She must have had her own dwelling. Possibly a single woman with her own dwelling in an ancient town. She took him in. Of course, she probably fed him and nursed him. They probably had some type of a relationship, especially for him to trust her to a level that he's going to tell where his strength came from. The only people that knew where his strength came from that we know of is his parents. There's no other documentation of him sharing this besides with the woman named Delilah. And so she formed a relationship with the Philistine leaders because they seen that she had a connection with him. So this opens up the discussion for trauma dumping. But instead of, like, you can see this in like many dynamics of relationships, that men, even sometimes women, but especially women, because we are the more nurturing of the two between male and female, that men will let their defenses down and just pretty much share and dump with women. But let me explain mainly where we can see this. So Delilah, although she was not a sex worker, that in the industry, which I will talk about more in the members only video, there's so many women that share their stories about how from prostitution to exotic dancers and those people that are in that industry, that men feel comfortable enough to tell them their darkest secrets, their darkest fantasies, and tell them the traumas that they experience, and they would trauma dump. But however, there is an energetic exchange there. They're getting paid pretty much to be a therapist, a sexy therapist, pretty much. And we don't know if Delilah was threatened. Samson didn't pay her. It doesn't say that he paid her for her services or what kind of exactly what type of relationship, how deep it ran. But we don't know if the Philistines, as they did with his first wife, threatened her for that information and decided to also sweeten the pot with giving her money. We don't know that. So she nursed him back to a certain level of health. He felt with her pushing him, and he was definitely wounded. I will always wonder, like, how in the world you don't see that every time that you tell her what could be like the secret, that all of a sudden the Philistines come. Obviously he went through so much trauma that he didn't recognize that. Mental health professionals are needed. A lot of times, whether it be the wife, maybe the target of unhealthy dynamics. I'm not saying this is everybody, but we do live in a patriarchal society, so it's under the radar. I didn't realize a lot of this stuff that I realize now after maturing, after being exposed to other people's stories and doing the healing journey myself, that I could see things from a whole nother filter now. That a lot of times with women, they take on the burdens of everyone, and that is by design and not necessarily a divine design, because we have instances, not necessarily with this one, but in other cases, like I said before, I'm going to do the Proverbs 31 woman, and those several archetypes that are there that paint the picture that the wife should be also the therapist too. But we're not trained for these situations, and a lot of men feel more, I guess, safe when they can share their fantasies with a person. I guess that must open up the door for more vulnerability. Let's look at the dichotomy between Delilah and his first wife. Okay, so Delilah, independent, she got paid, she stayed safe, versus his first wife was put in jeopardy by her relationship with Samson. She complied, and she still ended up unalived, a pile of ashes, just like Lot's wife. I'm going to touch a little bit on Lot's wife here. So Lot, a relative of Abraham, he see the angels out there, decided to invite them into his dwelling. Now the thing about an angel is supposed to be a divine being that is fully capable of protecting themselves, much more than an actual human. But he decides to invite them into his house. The village people, especially men, wanted to with them. However, Lot offers up his daughters. He offers up literally one of the women that worked in the house. Some call her a slave. She was pushed out there, attacked and violated throughout the night. Later on, her body cut up into 12 pieces, representing Israel, which is another toxic relationship between Yahweh and his bride, Israel. And Lot's wife experienced all this trauma herself, witnessing all of this. Now, in another story, she's actually left there to turn into a pillar of salt. Some say that it's a couple different traditions with that. But regardless, she was turned into a pillar of ashes, a pillar of salt. For looking back, when that all could have been avoided if he just had thought of his family to protect them. With his daughters doing what they did, I think it was a trauma response. Now, I'm not saying it was right, but I think it was a trauma response. After all of that stuff that they seen, what happened to the other lady and what happened to their mom, it's a lot. Now, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that they had a sexual relationship, Delilah and Samson. Let's just say that they possibly did. Now, sex therapy and magic is a real thing. So I've done a discussion about head working. I mentioned Delilah about head working with Hadassah and Esther. Well, Esther and Hadassah are the same person. There's two different names. About sex magic, glamour magic, as well as with Ruth and Boaz. You can check out those videos. But with head working, so head working, your head is divided into different sections, a person's head. So the head is also related to the sun because the consciousness. So there's another tap on that solar energy, on that symbolism with the sun. And being he's very arrogant, you know what, you get it. Yeah. Him laying his head on her lap represents vulnerability. It represents like being a mother figure, nourishing that inner masculine, that inner child within him. She is known to be a head worker, using oils, massages. Probably her voice was very soothing as well. Also, her seductress energy. This also reminds me of Jezebel a bit because of her seductress energy when it came to her husband. I did a video about her. You can also check that out. But I think with Delilah, it was more a gentle, motherly energy. Not only just working his head with sensual massages. Now, I believe that this could have led to some level of physical intimacy, possibly. But regardless if it was literal physical intimacy, like as far as that it still was a level of intimacy and vulnerability that sex typically represents in text. So his hair, it also represented his strength because he was never to cut his hair because that's where his strength resides. In women in that culture, the hair was considered to be sacred. That's why they would cover their heads. It's also other reasonings why they would cover their heads because of so many other reasons too, having to do with more esoteric reasons. But the hair was also related to beauty. And later on, what ended up happening to him after he was captured, that his eyes were gouged out. So if you look at his pattern of lusting over really beautiful women, that is the lust of the flesh, which is the eyes. You see something and you lust after it. So one of his struggles, one of his inner battles, as you would see on the tarot card, the strength card, you have the woman that is pretty much taming the lion. So the lion is a beast, but yet he is tamed in the woman's presence, and that represents Samson and Delilah perfectly, or Samson and pretty much any woman for the most part. So his lust of his eyes, of his flesh, is what really got the best of him. So I believe that symbolically, him having his eyes gouged out was representing his lust over beauty, over beautiful things. I'm pretty sure that he adorned himself with fanciness. He probably liked the best of the best. But yeah. Okay, Divine Ones, thank you so much for tuning in. For those that are members or that would like to become a member, you can join for as little as $2.99 a month for right now. And you will have access to the members only library as well as weekly content and PDFs, the private members only Discord. So go ahead and join. I will post extra information about Delilah, PDF, as well as I'm going to do an additional video